Xenolinguist Thessa Vrain had built her entire diplomatic career on a single foundational skill: detecting deception. She could read the microscopic vocal tremors of a crying negotiator preparing to break a trade agreement 3 full seconds before he spoke the lie aloud. She had never once needed that skill with a human being, and the day she finally understood why terrified her more than any hostile fleet ever had. The Osrankai Compact had spent 4 centuries perfecting the science of deception detection, developing biometric and linguistic analysis so sophisticated that no species within their considerable sphere of diplomatic contact could reliably lie to a trained Osrankai negotiator without detection. It was, alongside their formidable military capability, one of the Compact's most valuable strategic assets, allowing them to negotiate treaties, trade agreements, and territorial disputes with a confidence no other galactic power could match, because they always, eventually, knew exactly what the other side was actually thinking. Humanity was the first species in 400 years of Compact diplomatic history that Thessa Vrain's considerable expertise simply could not read. It began, as these things often do, as a minor anomaly buried within an otherwise unremarkable trade negotiation. Thessa had been assigned to lead the Compact's delegation for Earth's admission into the Outer Trade Consortium, a routine diplomatic assignment given humanity's modest technological standing and limited strategic significance within the broader galactic community. She approached the negotiation with the same confident thoroughness that had defined her considerable career, expecting, based on decades of successful practice, to read humanity's negotiating position with the same clarity she had always applied to every previous species the Compact had encountered. 3 days into the negotiation, she found herself, for the first time in her professional life, genuinely uncertain whether she understood anything about what she was actually hearing. "Your proposed tariff structure is acceptable," said Ambassador Reginald Acaffer, humanity's senior trade representative, during their 3rd formal negotiating session, his voice carrying none of the microscopic vocal indicators Thessa's considerable training had taught her to associate with deception, none of the subtle physiological tells her biometric monitoring equipment was specifically calibrated to detect. Every metric available to her considerable expertise confirmed, with total confidence, that Ambassador Acaffer was telling the truth. She discovered, 4 days later, reviewing documentation her own intelligence division had subsequently gathered, that the tariff structure had been, in fact, entirely unacceptable to humanity's actual negotiating position, a strategic concession Earth's diplomatic corps had deliberately decided to accept temporarily. For reasons that had nothing to do with genuine satisfaction, and everything to do with broader strategic calculations, Thessa's careful biometric analysis had entirely failed to detect. "I do not understand," she told her own intelligence chief, a methodical Osrankai analyst named Vessel Korath, who had spent considerable time reviewing her detailed reports from the negotiation with mounting professional concern. "My equipment confirmed genuine truthfulness. Ambassador Acaffer's statement registered no deceptive markers whatsoever across every metric our 4 centuries of accumulated methodology have developed." Yet his actual negotiating position, confirmed through subsequent intelligence gathering, directly contradicted what he stated. "Perhaps our equipment requires recalibration for human physiology," Vessel suggested, though his own tone carried the particular caution of someone who suspected the explanation was considerably more complicated than a simple technical malfunction. Thessa spent the following months, extending well beyond the original trade negotiations' modest diplomatic scope, conducting an extensive personal investigation into a phenomenon that had begun to genuinely unsettle her considerable professional confidence. She reviewed hundreds of hours of recorded human diplomatic exchanges, cross-referenced against subsequent verified outcomes, searching methodically for the specific pattern that would explain how an entire species could apparently defeat detection methodology. Her own civilization had spent 4 centuries refining into what she had always considered a genuinely reliable science. What she eventually discovered proved considerably more unsettling than any simple deception, because it was not, in fact, deception at all. Humans do not lie the way every other species we have encountered lies, she explained to a gathering of compact intelligence officials, 6 months into an investigation that had, by that point, generated considerable concern across the compact's broader diplomatic and strategic apparatus. Our detection methodology has always operated on a foundational assumption. Our 4 centuries of successful practice never previously required us to question. That deception involves a detectable gap between what a speaker genuinely believes and what they choose to say aloud. A gap that produces measurable physiological and linguistic indicators regardless of a speaker's species or cultural background. Humanity has developed something our methodology has no established framework for detecting, because it does not create that gap at all. When Ambassador Okafor told me the tariff structure was acceptable, he was not lying in any sense my equipment could detect, because in that specific, narrow moment, within the specific diplomatic frame he had constructed, the statement was, in a genuinely meaningful sense, true. Humanity has developed the capacity to construct entire, internally consistent frameworks of contextual truth, strategic positions they genuinely believe, in the moment of speaking, to be accurate and defensible, even when those positions directly contradict their actual, underlying strategic objectives. High Counselor Vesren Asa, presiding over the emergency session Thessa's findings had prompted, pressed her for clarification the assembled officials clearly found difficult to fully process. You are suggesting humans possess some form of genuine cognitive capability to believe contradictory things simultaneously, in a manner that defeats detection methodology built around identifying the gap between genuine belief and stated position. I am suggesting something I find myself considerably difficult to fully articulate, Counselor, precisely, because it represents a genuinely novel category of communication our 4 centuries of experience never previously required us to develop language for, Thessa said. Humans possess an extraordinary capacity for what their own psychological literature describes as compartmentalization. The ability to hold multiple, sometimes genuinely contradictory frameworks of belief and strategic calculation simultaneously, each one experienced in its own specific context as entirely genuine. When Ambassador Okafor stated the tariff structure was acceptable, he was drawing on a specific diplomatic framework, one where accepting that structure served humanity's broader strategic timeline, and within that framework, the statement was not a lie at all. It was a genuine, considered truth, constructed and believed with complete sincerity, even though a different, equally genuine framework, humanity's actual underlying negotiating objectives, would have produced an entirely different, contradictory statement. Our detection methodology cannot identify deception here, Counselor, because there is no deception occurring in any sense our 4 centuries of accumulated science has ever previously needed to define. There is only a species capable of genuinely, sincerely believing multiple contradictory things, each one true within its own specific strategic context, in a manner our own cognitive architecture apparently does not share. The revelation generated, across the following months, a strategic crisis within compact diplomatic circles considerably more significant than the specific trade negotiation that had first uncovered it. 4 centuries of compact diplomatic dominance had rested substantially on their unmatched capacity to verify truthfulness across any diplomatic exchange, a capability that had allowed the compact to negotiate from a position of genuine informational advantage against every previous species they had encountered. Humanity represented something their considerable accumulated methodology had never previously needed to counter, a species whose sincerity itself provided no reliable signal of their actual strategic position, not because they were skilled liars in any conventional sense, but because their fundamental cognitive architecture allowed them to construct and genuinely believe contextual truths that bore no necessary relationship to their broader, underlying objectives. This represents a genuinely unprecedented strategic vulnerability, High Counselor Asa said, during a subsequent session convened specifically to address the crisis. One our considerable diplomatic history has never previously required us to confront. If humanity's sincerity provides no reliable indication of their actual position, our entire negotiating methodology, built across 4 centuries around the assumption that verified truthfulness represents meaningful strategic information, may prove fundamentally inadequate against human diplomatic engagement. Thessa Vrain, having spent considerable months immersed in the specific phenomenon that had upended her entire professional framework, offered an assessment that would eventually become foundational to a complete restructuring of compact diplomatic doctrine regarding human contact. I do not believe humanity has developed this capability deliberately, as a specific strategic weapon against detection methodology like ours, she said. I believe, based on considerable research into their own historical and psychological literature, that this represents something closer to a fundamental feature of human cognitive architecture, developed across their species' considerable evolutionary and social history, for reasons entirely unrelated to interspecies diplomacy. Humans, it appears, evolved this capacity for genuine, sincere contextual belief, specifically because their own social structures, historically fragmented across competing groups with frequently conflicting interests, required individuals capable of navigating complex, sometimes genuinely contradictory loyalties and strategic positions without the kind of cognitive dissonance that would otherwise prove psychologically unsustainable. A human diplomat can genuinely, sincerely believe a specific negotiating position is correct, within the frame of a specific relationship or strategic timeline, while simultaneously maintaining an entirely different genuine belief about their species' broader objectives, without experiencing this as contradiction or deception at all. This is not a weapon humanity has built against us, Counselor. It is simply how their species has always processed complex social reality, and it happens, entirely incidentally, to defeat every detection methodology our 4 centuries of diplomatic science have ever developed. The Compact's diplomatic corps spent the following 2 years developing an entirely revised approach to human contact, one that abandoned their traditional reliance on truthfulness verification in favor of methodologies considerably more focused on observed behavioral consistency over extended time periods, a strategic adjustment that generated considerable internal resistance from officials whose entire careers had been built around the confident, reliable methodology human contact had suddenly rendered obsolete. Ambassador Reginald Acaffer, informed years later, during a considerably more advanced stage of human compact diplomatic relations, of the specific crisis his own routine negotiating statements had inadvertently triggered within compact strategic circles, offered a response that Thessa Vrain would eventually include, with his permission, within her own extensive academic writing on the subject. I want to be honest with you, Thessa, since we've built up enough trust at this point that I think honesty actually serves both of us better than diplomatic caution, he said, during a private conversation held years after their initial, unsettling first negotiation. I wasn't lying to you in that first negotiation when I said the tariff structure was acceptable. I genuinely believed it in that specific moment, within the specific strategic frame I was operating in. My government had decided, for reasons that made complete sense within our broader 5-year trade strategy, that accepting an unfavorable short-term tariff structure served our longer-term objectives considerably better than pushing back and risking the broader negotiations collapse. Within that frame, the statement was completely true. I wasn't performing sincerity I didn't feel. I actually felt it completely in that moment. It's just that I was also, simultaneously, holding a different, equally genuine understanding that the specific terms themselves weren't ideal, an understanding that existed in a different strategic frame entirely, one that mattered for different purposes, at different moments, in the ongoing relationship. I don't think most humans could fully explain how we do that honestly, because it's not really a skill we consciously developed. It's just how we've always processed complicated situations, going back long before any of us had the vocabulary to describe it clinically the way you eventually did. "Does this trouble you?" Thessa asked. Understanding now that your species negotiating sincerity, however genuine in each individual moment, provides no reliable overall signal of your government's actual strategic intentions. Ambassador Akaffer considered the question with the same measured, thoughtful care he had always brought to their diplomatic relationship, an honesty Thessa had, over years of subsequent collaboration, come to genuinely trust despite fully understanding its fundamentally different underlying architecture than her own species' more straightforward relationship with truth. "I think it should trouble you less than you probably still find it does, if I'm being honest," he said. "Because here's the thing about how humans actually process this, once you understand it properly instead of just fearing what it means for your detection equipment. We don't use this capacity to deliberately deceive people we're negotiating with, most of the time. Most humans, most of the time, genuinely want to reach agreements that serve everyone reasonably well. What this capacity actually does is let us hold space for complexity your species apparently doesn't need to hold, competing genuine interests, shifting strategic timelines, the simple reality that what serves us well today might not be exactly what serves us well in 5 years, without that complexity collapsing into the kind of paralysis or dishonesty you might expect. I think, honestly, that's not actually a weapon against you, Thessa. I think it's just a different, considerably messier way of navigating the same basic problem every diplomatic relationship eventually faces. How do you stay genuinely honest while also holding multiple, sometimes competing truths about what actually serves your people's interests? You built a detection system that assumes there's always one clean, singular truth beneath every statement. We just never developed that particular assumption, because our own history taught us pretty early that reality is usually more complicated than any single truth can fully capture. Thessa Vrain's eventual academic treatise on the phenomenon, published 4 years after her initial, unsettling discovery, and eventually incorporated into revised diplomatic training across the entire Osrinkai Compact, represented a fundamental philosophical reconsideration that extended well beyond the original, narrow, technical question of detection methodology. We approached humanity's apparent immunity to deception detection as a strategic vulnerability, a gap in our considerable accumulated diplomatic science that demanded urgent correction, she wrote. I have come to believe, across 4 years of careful study, that this framing fundamentally misunderstood what we were actually observing. Humanity is not deceiving us in any sense our 4 centuries of methodology has ever needed to define. They are demonstrating a cognitive capacity our own species, for reasons rooted in our considerably more unified social and evolutionary history, never developed, the capacity to hold multiple, genuinely sincere, sometimes contradictory truths simultaneously, each one fully believed within its specific context, without this producing the kind of cognitive dissonance our own psychology would find genuinely unsustainable. This is not a weapon. It is a fundamentally different relationship with truth itself, one that emerged from a species whose historical complexity, whose competing internal loyalties and shifting strategic circumstances, required exactly this kind of cognitive flexibility to survive and function. I do not believe our detection methodology failed against humanity, because humanity is more skilled at deception than any species we have previously encountered. I believe it failed because humanity does not experience the specific, narrow category of deception our methodology was built to detect, at least not in the same clean, singular way every previous species within our diplomatic experience has always produced it. We spent 4 centuries building increasingly sophisticated tools to find the gap between what a speaker believes and what they say. Humanity's genuine innovation, if we can even call it that, given how deeply it appears embedded in their basic cognitive architecture, was never in learning to hide that gap more skillfully than anyone else. It was in developing a mind capable of genuinely, sincerely closing it, over and over again, in as many different contextual frames as their complicated, contradictory circumstances actually required. She concluded her treatise with an observation that would become, within subsequent generations of Osrankai diplomatic training, one of the most frequently cited principles for engaging with human counterparts across the growing web of diplomatic relationships that would eventually connect the two civilizations. I was afraid in the early months of this investigation of what humanity's apparent immunity to our detection methodology actually meant, whether we had encountered a species capable of deceiving us with a sophistication our considerable science could never hope to counter, she wrote. I no longer believe that fear was warranted, though I understand completely why it arose, and why it continues to trouble many of my colleagues who have not yet had the opportunity to understand this phenomenon as thoroughly as my own research eventually allowed me to. Humanity cannot be reliably read by our detection methodology, not because they are lying to us more skillfully than any species we have previously encountered, but because they are, in a very real sense, telling us something considerably more honest than what our own methodology was ever designed to detect. They are showing us, in every diplomatic exchange, the genuine, complicated truth of a mind capable of holding multiple sincere positions at once, a mind shaped by a history our own considerably more unified species never had to navigate. I do not believe this makes humanity untrustworthy, counselors, whatever our initial alarm may have suggested. I believe it makes them considerably more complicated to understand than any species we have previously encountered, and I believe that complexity, properly understood rather than feared, represents not a threat to 4 centuries of compact diplomatic practice, but an invitation to develop something our own accumulated science has never previously required. Not better tools for detecting deception, but the patience and genuine curiosity necessary to understand a mind fundamentally, sincerely different from our own, on its own considerable terms.